Today, we are moving from the 15th century into modernity, and I'm going to be covering various moments of challenge and crisis which potentially jeopardize the story that we've spoken about hitherto. And I'm going to begin with what seems like an obvious place today, but actually it's a rather unusual one. So we're going to begin with Charlemagne. Do you remember Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, then the Lombards, then from 800 AD, the first emperor of the so-called Holy Roman Empire, that empire which Voltaire waggishly said was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But in the mind of Charlemagne, he was a Roman emperor reincarnate. And as we said last time, a major part of Charlemagne's existence was about framing himself as the new torchbearer of the classical world. But I'm not going to begin with him in the 9th century. I'm going to move to the 15th century and specifically to 1439. Where are we in the world? We're in Aachen, which in modern terms is in West Germany, very near the Belgian border. And in 1439 in Aachen, a major festival is about to kick off. Charlemagne Fest. What's that, you may ask? It is the display of hundreds of relics of Charlemagne and of the Carolingian world to anyone who cares to come to Aachen to see them. And it's expected that hundreds of thousands of people will make a pilgrimage to see these holy relics of Charlemagne and other saints. Well, in Aachen at the time, there is an enterprising chap in his 30s or 40s, we don't know his exact age, who has a business model which seems perfect. What he's done is he's cast about 100,000 little mirrors out of a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony. And the idea is he's going to sell these little mirrors to anyone who makes the pilgrimage to Aachen. What will they do with the mirror? They will hold it up to the relic, and holy light will emerge from the relic, enter their little handheld mirror, and they will take home some holiness with them. They're going to sell like hot cakes. But the world is the world, and fate is fate, and a mixture of plague and flooding call off the whole festival. Nothing happens, no one arrives, and this man, who's put not just all of his money, but a massive amount of money loaned into him, into his business venture, goes bankrupt. There he is with 100,000 tiny mirrors that he can't possibly shift. So what does he do? Rather than having his own meltdown, he melts down those particular cast metals and starts to play with other ideas. His name is Johannes Gensfleisch Zuladen zum Gutenberg. And Gutenberg, through the 1440s, uses his skills as a jeweler, as a goldsmith, and as this attempted seller of gift mirrors, to experiment with a completely new way of doing things in Europe. That is to say, pushing back against the timely world of manuscript production, where humans got to sit down and in the most beautiful calligraphy possible, copy a text, but instead create metal cast type of all the letters of the alphabet, uppercase and lowercase, and use that as a way of printing. And we don't know when he did it, we don't know when the breakthrough happened, but in the 1440s, Gutenberg moves back to Strasbourg, and then by 1450 he's in Mainz, so moving around the German world. And come 1450, he has invented the printing press. Now, it's entirely true that by this point in the Eastern world, in China, a printing press of movable type existed. But as we saw in the first lecture with writing, these are moments of independent innovation and creation. And for whatever reason, the printing press in China is never a major feature of book production. It's thought not to be the best way to do things. But in Germany, from the 1440s, Gutenberg is onto something entirely new. But Gutenberg being Gutenberg, he has no money, so he needs business partners. And he gets two people, a chap called Johann Fust, who gives him loads of money, and a guy called Peter Schoeffer, who was a professional scribe, but could bring his knowledge of book production into the world of the Gutenberg press. And this press takes the technology of wine presses and olive presses and is able to create full pages of text. And we really don't know what the first text printed by the Gutenberg press was. It could be indulgences, that is to say, little printed notices which allow the purchaser to get remission from punishment in hell for their sins. You will know that indulgences were sold by the Catholic Church and were, in due course, a very controversial thing. But they take time to write by hand, and if you can print them, the job's a good one. It may be a Latin grammar. Donatus was the major writer of Latin grammars, and possibly that was the first book printed in Europe. But the one we've all heard of, the one which has 160 to 180 copies made by Gutenberg and the team, is the 42-line Bible, that full work of the Latin Bible in the Old and New Testament form. Only about 50 copies survive of that, and only 21 complete ones. But it is the model, the marker, that there is a new way of spreading literature. And it's quite strange that it's not as though the world suddenly mutates on the emergence of this technology. It's thought to be too fiddly, the setup costs are ridiculous, and even though it's fast, 3 people can make 200 copies of a book in 100 days, whereas in the world of the scribe, 3 people working together would write a large book in about 2 months. So in 100 days, they might create the best part of 2 books rather than the 200. Even so, it's not taken as a breakthrough moment at the time. Gutenberg goes bankrupt. He falls out financially with the other investors, and Fust and Schurfer take over the press, and they become the major printers in Mainz. As to Gutenberg, he goes into poverty. He's eventually welcomed back, but he's buried a man not recognized for his breakthrough, and we don't even know now where his grave is. This is the man often voted the most important figure of the second millennium AD. I'm not sure about that, but people vote that way. And certainly the inventor of the most important invention of the second millennium AD. He's disappeared from the world. But soonish, by the 1460s, the printing press had been taken by Germans all around the European world, in particular, crossing the Alps down into Italy. And the reason that that's so significant for my tale is it's in Italy, for the most part, where the manuscripts of the Latin and Greek classics are based. So come 1465, that is the first year that these classical texts I've been talking about finally hit print. Probably in Subiaco, in Italy, Cicero's De Oratore is probably the first classical work. Come 1467, we've got our first Latin poem. Juvenal satires are the first work of poetry in print. And by the 1470s, Greek texts come into play as well. A strange work by Homer, a strange little work called the Batrachomuomachia, the battle between frogs and mice, a mock epic, is the first book in Greek. So it could be that my tale is effectively over at this point. Printing comes along. It allows for the mass production of books, and anything that makes the move from manuscript to print is safe. Well, actually, that begs several questions which I've skirted over in a rather improper fashion in these lectures. For instance, I've said nothing about the way where the word classics comes from. And although I've used the word canon, I've said nothing about what's going on. So for the next stage of this talk, I'd like to touch upon what gets the privilege of surviving to the 15th century in order to become a printed book and effectively survive forever. So we'll start with the canon. The canon takes us back to the Greek world and indeed back to Alexandria. I've mentioned the librarians there several times, trying to order knowledge and make sense of what was known in the world. And it's at that time that certain groupings, certain lists are made. It is decided that of all the great orators in Athens, 10 are canonical and worth studying. The 10 Attic orators. Of all the lyric poets writing their beautiful verse, 9 are worth talking about, the 9 lyric poets. And of the dramatists, of the tragedians, 3 get the particular title of being the canonical trio. I've mentioned them in the past: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But this idea of canonizing literature actually comes up in the world of the Bible and not the so-called pagan classics. If we get to the 4th century AD, Athanasius of Alexandria comes up with the idea of ta canonis domina, the books that have been canonized, the books that have been measured by a canon, which is a measuring stick. They have passed muster, they are in. And what's he talking about? He's talking about the books that deserve to be in the Bible versus those which are non-canonical and are apocryphal. And the numbers emerge that 39 books should be in the Old Testament, 27 in the New, and that is the birth of the idea of the canon. But the idea of canon, meaning the accepted text, is a modern one, actually. That's an 18th century invention. So going back to that canonical trio of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, here's a problem. Aeschylus wrote something like 89 plays, Sophocles 120, Euripides 92. I can't add that up, but it's going to be something getting towards 300 plays. And yet, if we go to our oldest manuscripts of these authors, we get 7 by Aeschylus, 7 by Sophocles, and 10 by Euripides. Why? Because some one person, maybe in the 5th century AD, unknown to us, perhaps a school teacher, decided that the way the world's going, we can't have everyone read every work by these great playwrights. We've got to choose. We've got to make a judgment. We've got to use our critical faculties. And he, almost certainly a he, but I allow for it to be a she, makes the decision that the 7 best plays of Aeschylus involve the Oresteia and the Ajax, and, well, not Ajax, the Persians and others. Sophocles involves Oedipus Tyrannus and the Philoctetes and the Electra. And Euripides is my favourite, this individual decides, and I'm going to choose 10. And this narrow selection, this sort of greatest hits, changes the whole fate of these authors. Every other play they wrote effectively disappears from us. So 7 of 89 of Aeschylus, 7 of 120 of Sophocles, and 10 of 92 of Euripides. But you might say, well, how's that going to work? If we've got a given school teacher somewhere who's making his own little curriculum, how has that changed the rest of the world? Why doesn't full collections survive? Well, the answer is it's extremely expensive, extremely difficult and time-consuming to copy 120-odd plays. So the shorter selection, the greatest hits, carry through. And in the case of Euripides, there's quite a funny, or at least whimsical development which happens. We've got our 10 canonical Euripides plays. Great. It's got the Medea in, the Bacchae, quality stuff. But if you go and look up the plays that survive to us by Euripides in a bookshop, you'll find not 10, but 19. And you'll find that 9 of those have very similar titles in terms of their first letter. You've got the Helen, the Heracles, the Heraclidae, next letter the Ion, Iphigenia in Aulis, Iphigenia in Tauris. What's going on? Well, strangely, a little wedge, an alphabetical wedge of the full collection of Euripides happens to survive. It somehow breaks through into the medieval world. So the collection of the entirety of these authors did survive for a bit, but no one had the energy or the focus to keep it going. So in the Greek world, which we've talked about at several points, a decision was made by someone as to what is worthy of preserving. And for the most part, we live with those consequences. Moving to the Latin world, a similar thing happens. But again, it's complex. This word classical, classics, which I've gone on and on about, where does it come from? Well, if you look up classis in Latin, you'll find that it means anything where order is imposed. It could be, yes, that's right. It could be a set of soldiers drawn up in battle order. It could be a navy of ships put in a particular format. It could be a class of people, either in the sense of pupils brought into order for education, or socioeconomic class. And it's that last one that actually gives us the word classical. Aulus Gellius, a man you don't need to know about, who's writing in the 2nd century AD, points out that classicus doesn't just mean linked with a classis, linked with a class. It's shorthand for the top class, the top bracket. And he uses a metaphor from taxation to say that the top tier tax bracket, they're the real deal when it comes to society. And therefore, in the world of literature, a classicus scriptor, a classical author, should only be used of the best. Now, you will say that seems frightfully elite. The idea that the best socio and economically correlate with the best in terms of literature. And I would agree with you entirely. It's deliberately elite. That is the point. So this looks quite good for us in our hope of getting the best and the most engaging texts of the ancient world to survive to us. But it's more complicated than that, because Aulus Gellius is a nobody. Him saying that the classical texts are the best texts has no bearing on what is read. And if it can't affect what is read, it affects what is copied. And as we said in an earlier lecture, if a text isn't copied into the codex made of animal skin, then it's game over. It's not surviving. So again, this conspiracy theory idea that a small cabal of people made the decisions as to what survives is only sometimes true. And for Latin literature, it's almost entirely untrue. The answer is it was school children that had the biggest bearing. It was down to what was read in the school classroom. And as I've said several times, Rome in the 4th century changes fundamentally. First by tolerating Christianity, and then by becoming officially Christian. So when we get to the 5th century and the fall of the Roman Empire, what really matters is what books are being read and copied in the classroom. And the answer is, it's not just Christian texts. Christianity has no pedagogical tradition, no way of teaching people Latin. It's got nothing to do with Latin as a faith, really. So the classroom was still relying on the bread and butter texts of the pagan Romans. So Virgil and Horace as poets are read. Cicero is the king of prose literature. And various other particular poets and prose authors are the canon. And those particular choices of the classroom determine what happens for the next 1,000 years. Last lecture, I went from the 5th century to the 15th century, and it's generally true that for all of their activity, copying and sharing manuscripts in the medieval period, the core classical authors that are copied and which survive don't change. So there's no medieval figure who says, right guys, I've heard about authors ABC, find them, copy them, we're going to change the game. No, there's an inertia as to what is worthy of preservation. So touching upon what we said last time, it might seem that anything that gets into a monastery and is looked after by this culture of respecting the physical book, respecting the written word, is going to be safe and survive to where I began, namely the birth of the printed book. But that's not true. It's not true for several reasons. Books have no right to survive once they're in a monastery. And what we find is that these Christians who've segregated themselves from the world to worship God as best they can, sometimes are running low on money, and crucially, they're running low on parchment. They're running low on things to write on. So what do if they need more books talking about the Bible, commenting on things that are crucial to their sense of faith? Well, they reuse and recycle. And you may know this word palimpsest. Palimpsest, scraped back, scraped off. Well, this was the major way of creating new books if you didn't have new parchment. You take a book, which is on this animal skin necessarily, and you scrape off the text and then write what you want on it. And that process, although it's constructive in one way, is manifestly destructive of the original text. So all sorts of major authors, Plautus, the comedian, Cicero, the great statesman, Ovid, Virgil, these often survive to us in a palimpsested form where a Christian text has been written over them. And for the most part, you can't read that text. In the 19th century, chemicals were poured on them to try and get rid of the top text, and it worked for a bit, but then hydrochloric acid poured onto manuscripts is not a good way of looking after books. So some of those books have since been destroyed by 19th century activity. In the modern age, different kinds of ultraviolet and spectral light can help read these texts, but fundamentally it was a destructive process. And just to give you a sense of what's going on, let's fast forward to the end of the monastic period. Obviously, monasteries continue, but by that I mean the 14th and 15th centuries before the birth of print and the Reformation changed things very fast indeed. And for that, we're not going to go to Petrarch, who we spoke about in the 14th century. We're going to go to, instead, Giovanni Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron, and one of those early figures, those humanists who turned back to the classical world. Well, Boccaccio, at some point in the 14th century, we don't know quite when, takes a trip to Monte Cassino. And those of you who were here last time will remember that Monte Cassino, since 529, was the founding place for the Benedictine order, and therefore the monastic communities that preserved these books. And he goes there, as I say, in the 14th century, and he asks one of the monks if he can see the library. Monte Cassino had one of the greatest scriptoria in the world, producing a huge amount of really important books. And the monk kind of shrugs and says, yeah, it's up those stairs, off you go. He goes up the stairs, finds that the door is unlocked, very strangely, and according to his description, he finds utter chaos. He finds books not just covered in dirt and mud and filth, but he finds weeds and plants growing and everything in complete disarray. It so happens that this is the backdrop to Boccaccio taking a lot of books from Monte Cassino at the same time. But there's this general sense that decline is affecting most monastic libraries. Boccaccio says that books were being cut up in order to create little strips for use in liturgical services. So classical works were being ripped apart, leaves taken out for use for Christian purposes. And if you look at the accounts of these figures in the 14th and early 15th century, they're touring the monasteries, finding things largely in a state of disarray, and liberating the Latin and Greek classics that they're seeking to find. Well, this is an important moment because it's the bridge between the monastic community as separate and the dragging of classical authors into the world proper. Last time I was speaking about the universities, and one of the things I said, or at least sought to say, was that weirdly the universities are not that important for the classics directly. There's philosophy, there's scholasticism, there's stuff going on, but they are not reading and preserving the classics in a general sense. But they are doing something extremely important. They are increasing literacy and therefore the demand to engage with literary texts. And just as an example of this, if we look at the Latin word literatus, until about the 12th century, that means someone who can read literi, someone who is literate, which was a rare thing in the 12th century. 100 years later, literatus can't mean that anymore because too many people are literate. It's not interesting. Instead, literatus comes to mean someone who really knows his literature, someone who is learned. Okay, so the big change happening alongside humanism is a growth of people who can read and want to read more. At this point, we briefly fly over to China, because in China, in the early centuries AD, there's a new invention called paper in our terms. And although I won't get into the details, it is true once again that paper moves along the Silk Road, reaches the Islamic Caliphate of the time, moves along North Africa, enters Moorish Spain in the 11th century, and paper arrives as a new writing surface in, as I say, the 11th century and spreads into the rest of Europe. Why do we care about paper arriving? Because remember, papyrus died in Europe in the 4th century. It was cheap, but it didn't last. Parchment lasts, but is unbelievably expensive. and parchment had closed the door to wider learning. It was just too expensive to own a book. The arrival of paper, which is just wood pulp stretched out in complicated ways I don't understand, is a game changer. So in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, people can read manuscripts because they're now on a cheap substance. So the fact of the matter is that when printing emerges in 1440s, 1450s, we've got a university culture that is interested in reading more. We've got a humanistic culture, which, as I said last time, is turning back to the Greeks and Romans as a new way of doing things. And we have paper, which allows for books to be printed not on expensive animal skin, but on cheap as chips paper. Now, a brief etymological break. Some of you might like etymology, sense of where words come from. And I'll just briefly cover 4 words: paper, book, codex, and the Bible. Because all of these link in with everything I've been saying in these lectures. So paper actually comes from papyrus, the word. People regard its re-emergence as just like that cheap writing material we knew way back when, even though those were reeds of the papyrus plant. So the word paper and papyrus are the same word. Where does the word papyrus come from? Greek papyros. We don't know, but there's an interesting theory that it's Egyptian papyra, which means relating to the king, a royal object, because the pharaoh had control of the papyrus product. So it's a kind of strange world where paper, which has nothing to do with Egypt, actually might ultimately mean belonging to the pharaoh. Next, we've got codex and book. These are the same thing. Codex, as we know, is the book form where we open and close it. And book is a Germanic word. Both of them mean wood. Codex means wooden boards, and book means the beech tree. It's the same as the word in the beech tree. And that's actually reflecting a completely different Germanic tradition where people wrote on bits of bark. As to the Bible, why do we care about the etymology of the Bible? Well, the Bible is so called because it is the book, her biblos, the book. Why is a book biblos in Greek? Because biblos reflects the place Byblos or Byblis, modern Jabil, in Lebanon. The book is associated with the birth of writing, which, as I said in the first lecture, comes from Phoenicia, comes from the Lebanese world. So there's a lot of storied history in those words that I've been mentioning all the way through. So the tale I've told to this point is effectively one of chance survival within the monasteries based upon what was regarded as of particular interest. And it remains for me to sketch what happens after the 15th century, after printing really takes off. Well, for that, we need to pop down to Italy briefly and to reflect upon Greek. Because one of the bizarre features of Western Europe, as I've said before, but it always bears repeating, is that direct knowledge of Greek is missing for the best part of 1,000 years. We have various translations coming in, and with the fall of the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, we have Greek scholars coming in as well. But there still isn't direct knowledge of Greek. That eventually changes in Venice. It's in Venice that a chap called Aldus Manutius gets serious about Greek. And this is the first time anyone has been serious about Greek since the 5th century. And he sets up a new club called the Nea Academia. I mentioned last time the academy. This is the new academy. And the main rule is you can only speak Greek, and ideally classical Greek. And that club brings together Greek experts who crucially own books written in Greek, which means manuscripts. And he devises this new fiddly script to be able to print Greek. And suddenly, by 1500, the major Greek authors are able to be read in the West again. Aristotle appears in the 1490s. Sophocles and Euripides finally appear. The historians Herodotus and Thucydides, the orator Demosthenes, all of these major figures only return to the West in the early 1500s. And what about Plato? You'll know that famous quotation from about 100 years ago now, which goes along the lines of, the safest generalization about the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This is what A.N. Whitehead said in the 1920s, that fundamentally Plato shapes the European philosophical tradition. Well, no one's reading Plato in Western Europe for this 1,000 years. It's just not possible. There's a few translations here and there, and only in 1513 does Plato get printed, published, and circulated. So from this point, it really does look as though my tale is over. The manuscripts have been found, the ones that survived. They've been brought into print by someone, and hundreds of copies have been made of them, which can't all be destroyed because they're spread around the world. Just as with the Gutenberg Bible, there's copies in several countries. There isn't a complete one in Italy or Switzerland, but there's several in America. You can't destroy something once it's had a print run. Well, that's the theory, but actually there are moments of chaos in what follows. And for the last phase of this talk, I'm going to touch upon some moments of crisis and trouble which afflict the classics. Okay, so we've got to the 15th century, printing is up and running. But there are still huge religious tensions which are only going to get worse over the time to come. And we might think, well, okay, religious tensions. Why would problems within the Christian world impinge upon the classics? Well, for the most part, they don't, but at times they do. You may know this figure called Savonarola, who in the late 15th century gets control of the Florentine populace, stirs them up into a raving mob, and has the infamous bonfire of the vanities. People are to bring out the books which are no longer appropriate for this revivified sense of true Christianity. And Ovid, our friend Ovid, is caught up in that world, and manuscripts as well as printed books of Ovid are burned in the marketplace. Fundamentally, it's only Florence, so it doesn't make too much difference down the line. If we move into the 16th century, something very big is going to happen, and it's linked entirely with what I've been saying about Greek. For in 1516, Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, once of Rotterdam, but actually a roving scholar who really can't settle down anywhere, publishes the New Testament in the language it's meant to be in. And for the great majority of the last 1,000 years, the New Testament has been treated not just as a book in Latin, but as the reflection of God's words because God and Christ speak in Latin. Well, that's manifestly a falsehood, and Erasmus's Greek New Testament forces people to step back and see the actual substrate, the actual basis on which Christianity is built. 1 year after that, what happens in 1517? Martin Luther steps forward with 95 theses and says, guys, we've got to talk about the state of the Catholic Church. And he doesn't print them. He probably doesn't even nail them onto the door of the church, of the cathedral. Instead, he sends them privately by letter. But once wind is got that these theses are circulating, they are printed. And they're translated into German and circulated as well. Suddenly, thousands of copies of these theses are radiating out in a way that was impossible in a manuscript culture. By early 1518, things have just become chaotic. And to give you a sense of that, between 1517 and 1524, 7-year period, the amount of books produced by German presses increases 7 times. So the Reformation of Christianity that comes out of this period is given a rocket booster by printing. Is it true that without printing there would have been no Reformation? Probably not, but it certainly would have been slower, and perhaps, therefore, it could have been quashed and suppressed in a way that the Catholic Church hoped it would. Fast forward just to a few other snapshots that are of interest to us. In the mid-16th century, we've got the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent. They say we've got to get serious. Certain books are no longer appropriate. So they create the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of books that are banned. Thankfully, for the most part, that's Christian and scientific texts and doesn't really affect the classics. But it does create a dynamic, a sense that certain books can legitimately be destroyed. Moving into the 16th century in Northern Europe as it progresses, we could talk about England, the country we're in as I speak. What were the classics doing in England? Well, fundamentally, whether we like it or not, the tradition of the Northern Renaissance and the tradition that shapes Tudor and Stuart education and Shakespeare and Milton and everyone else is a creation of Erasmus's view of the humanities. We're to read Greek and Latin not primarily for spiritual enlightenment, but in order to read the best texts and become better rhetoricians, better writers, better artists with the word. So it's from that point that the particular classical texts that are prioritized are those which give you rhetorical flair. Cicero's number one, but also poets that write rhetorically. Lucan, who wrote about the Civil War, comes into play. Sallust, the historian, and even Terence, the comedian. These are the ones that form the basis of learning in school. Seneca is there too, the playwright Seneca. And if Seneca hadn't survived or been put in the classroom, Shakespeare would be nothing like the Shakespeare we know. The structure of a Shakespearean tragedy is fundamentally Senecan in its origin. A few generations later, Milton. Milton could not write Paradise Lost unless Virgil were in his veins. So I'm not saying that literature would be struggling without the classics, but I am saying the English classics that we know of would look fundamentally different if certain texts hadn't been prioritized in the classroom. There's just 3 more episodes I'd like to talk about before I come to an end, and you can ask whatever you like. The first is an interesting crisis at the end of the 17th century, in the 1690s. There's a so-called quarrel, or in French, querelle, between the ancients and the moderns. What is that? Well, fundamentally, this is the Renaissance spirit, the lifeblood draining away from Europe. There's a reckoning. What are we doing, guys? Are we trying to imitate as best as possible and to recreate the Greeks and Romans, always failing in being as good as them? Or is there a sense of progress and we are effectively standing on the shoulder of giants and building better on the basis of the classics? Who's winning? The ancients, who will always be ahead of us, or the moderns, who are progressing beyond the ancients? That's the nature of the debate. And it's fought in Oxford, in London, in Paris, in Cambridge, and fundamentally, rather boringly, no one can decide who wins. Instead, we get this weird marriage, which Jonathan Swift satirizes in his Battle of the Books, where fundamentally we need both. We need to live with the ancients, we can't escape them, but we need to do something with our own lives and do something new. Moving into the 19th century now, we get a similar crisis at the end of the 19th century. It's the high point of education in Britain in terms of the scale of ambition in public education. Public libraries spring up in the 1870s and the 1880s. The Universal Education Act demands that everyone have an education. And there's a real sense that both through translation and through the teaching of Latin and Greek in schools, the classics are open to everyone. But by the start of the 20th century, and with the First World War and with the subsequent Depression, there's a major sense that the classics are a luxury, but not a fundamental right that is intrinsic to what it is to be human. And since that point, 100 years ago, the classics have not recovered. Worse than that, the classics are not in any sense subdivided as they were meant to be. What do I mean by that? As I've said, in the ancient world, it was clear that some writing was the best and the rest wasn't. But because of the mechanisms that allow things to survive to the present day, we only got some of the good stuff and we got lots of the bad stuff because no one was in charge. So just to name some things, where is Ennius's Annales, the great epic poem of Rome? It's gone. Where is Julius Caesar's poetry and his tragedy Oedipus? Gone. Where's Varro's Antiquitates, the most learned book ever written in Rome? Utterly gone. Where's Ovid's Medea? Gone. Where's Emperor Claudius's 20-book history of the Etruscans and the Carthaginians? Gone. Okay? These are gone, so much so that they're never going to come back. So we're in a world where everything that survives from the Greco-Roman world is called the classics. And that's a nonsense, but a nonsense that some of my colleagues are quite happy to roll on with. They will not accept you're saying that poet X is manifestly better than poet Y. They will not accept that prose author Y, it would be so much better if he hadn't survived and we instead had prose author Z. Instead, everything's been lumped into a broader sense of just old, Greco-Roman. And that's no good, because there's no one in this room who can read all of the texts that survive. We've lost a sense of curating the best against everything else that lives on. So in two senses, I think the classics are temporarily in a torpor in the modern world. The first I've just outlined, there's no selection, there's no clear sense of which classical texts are worthy of our time ahead of others. But secondarily, there's no mechanism whereby people can step into the classics and gain cultural resonance by doing so. What do I mean? The classics have become outre, too weird, too elite, too sidelined. They're not a feature of political debate. They're not a feature of, generally speaking, literature. They're not even a feature of Netflix documentaries. Yes, there's stuff about the Greeks and the Romans, yada, yada, yada. But there's very little of taking written literature out of the ancient world and doing things with it. So we're in a world where, bizarrely, we've got the best access we could ever have to the classics that survive. We've got the world over interested in learning, exploring, independent creation, and yet we have no system to encourage people into the classics to do something with them. And I don't want to end on a downer as such, but I'm very interested to hear your thoughts as to how we could do something along these lines. How, given that for the most part of the history of the Western world, the classics have been in the water, in the air around us until about 100 years ago. How, given that that shaped the world we are in, can we set about reinstilling the vitality and the excitement of those texts that have built the world that surrounds us? Is it a top-down affair? Is it a bottom-up affair? Or do we need to think outside the box? For after all, if we are going to talk about the classics as classics, then we need to step up and know what to say to make that true. So I'm going to stop there because I've gone on long enough. But I, as in previous times, I'm extremely happy to talk about anything I have or more likely have not covered. So please, over to you for any questions.